there's an issue, just text something. All others can unmute, mute their system, so it will be good. Today we are meeting actually from our college office, SLMA. Of course, we had a power problem at the moment on generator. Hopefully, next 1 hour will be okay. So, thank you very much for joining in. Hopefully, it will be a successful one as the last one where we had probably over 100 people listening to the webinar. And at the beginning itself, I would like to thank again Dr. Chiranthalyanage for doing the hosting part of it, arranging the meeting. And the two lecturers, Dr. Sajith Painlangatilaka and Dr. Angela Isila Vijayaratne, agreeing to do this presentation. And of course, from next month, first Friday, that is the 3rd, we'll be going back to the Twin Mark. Probably we can host 100 people there. If there is a possibility, we might try to have it as a hybrid one with the webinar also attached to it. We'll see how it goes. Definitely, it will be on 3rd July, the Friday at the Twin Mark. So, to begin today's proceedings, I would like to invite Dr. Sajith Painlangatilaka, consultant in neurology and rehabilitation, EGH Ponragala, to begin her talk on benign joint hypermobility syndrome, overview on a neglected clinical entity. And by the way, while the lecture is going on, if you have any questions, you can go to your chat and type your questions. So at the end of it, we'll try to answer as many as possible. End of the lecture. Over to you, Sajith.
So everyone, I'm afraid that the SLMA office has lost power again. So they'll be joining in shortly, and we'd have to sort of bear with the technical difficulties for a few minutes till they get their power back on.
No, then they must be hearing. We are back.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Sorry about it. We had a power failure here. That's what the issue. We'll be back. I think. Okay. Just hold on for a minute. Sorry about that. I think we'll be back. I'll hand it to Sajitra.
Good afternoon, everybody. The topic I have chosen for today's lecture is benign hypermobility syndrome. It is going to be an overview on a neglected clinical entity. So in this study done by Professor Rodney Graham and Howard Bird on British consultant rheumatologist perceptions about hypermobility syndrome, it was found that 92% believe that hypermobility as a distinct clinical entity. However, there was a striking variability in the estimated clinic prevalence by these consultants and consensus about the diagnostic criteria being used. And there was little enthusiasm among the consultant rheumatologists for treatments that are currently available. And more than 50% were skeptical about the significant impact of hypermobility on people's lives, and more than 75% was skeptical about the significant contribution to the overall burden of the rheumatic disease. And there was little sign of awareness of findings in recent published studies. Therefore, it seems unlikely that evidence-based medicine is being practiced in this area of rheumatology. So I don't think our situation varies much when compared to the British consultant rheumatologist perception. So that's why I have chosen this topic today. So over the next half an hour or so, these are the areas that I'm going to cover. So what is benign joint hypermobility syndrome? So it's a hereditary disorder of connective tissues, which is characterized by hypermobility, often affecting multiple joints. So they have musculoskeletal pains, and there should not be any other systemic rheumatic disease explaining the hypermobility and the joint pains, such as Marfan's, Ehlers-Danlos, and osteogenesis imperfecta. So this diagram explains where benign joint hypermobility stands in the heritable disorders of connective tissue. So you can see your Marfan's is there in the fibrinogen, fibrillin defects side, and then the pseudoxanthoma is there in the elastin defect side. So benign joint hypermobility and hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, for which no specific gene has yet been found, is in the collagen collagen disorder. So what causes benign joint hypermobility? It's both nature and nurture, that is genes and environmental factors are found to play a role, because not all the patients with benign hypermobility the clinical presentation varies. So there's a large spectrum. However, there is no gene defect found yet, and only thing that is found is that there's reduced serum tennessine X level, which is an extracellular matrix protein in collagen, and also low levels of polydase activity, which is an enzyme needed in the catabolism of collagen. However, still there is no gene that is being found as to the cause of benign joint hypermobility. And interestingly, there are no demonstrable structural abnormalities in tendons or ligaments in this condition. So the clinical manifestations, as I mentioned before, there is no single mechanism. So there are several postulations. So one is the localized biomechanical overloading and chronic soft tissue injury, which can occur due to joint laxity and instability. The other one is repetitive mitral trauma, which causes overloading of the joints as a result of hypermobility. And also there is this decreased joint momentum in the lower extremities which requires greater force to maintain equilibrium in these patients. They can also have central sensitization, giving rise to these symptoms. And also due to the laxity of the tendons, the force, the force that is applied is not properly transmitted into the muscle, which causes reduced muscle bulk, which again can lead to the symptoms in these patients. And abnormalities of proprioception are also found in these patients, giving rise to repetitive microtrauma. So epidemiologically, the prevalence is thought to be about 3% in the UK, which rivals the bread and butter of rheumatologists, rheumatoid arthritis, even gout and fibromyalgia. But because this is an undiagnosed, commonly undetected condition, this 3%, this value may be higher than 3%. And there's a wide variation with age, sex, and ethnicity, and it's common in children and decreases with age, more common in women, and there are wide variations between ethnic groups, and it's found to be common in Asians and West Africans. So how do these patients present? They can present with commonly with chronic or recurrent joint pains, usually exacerbated with activity, and with no early morning stiffness. So in addition to the joint pains, because of all these pathophysiological mechanisms that I mentioned before, there can be juxta-articular manifestations like soft tissue rheumatism, like enthesitis, bursitis, tenosynovitis, and they are more prone for chondromalacia, rotator cuff problems, and mechanical back pain. And they can also present to the orthopedic surgeons with recurrent dislocations, subluxations, and even deformities like swan neck deformities which are correctable, can be a presenting feature, confusing the clinician as to the etiology of the deformity. 84% of them report fatigue, which is probably due to muscle weakness, and they also have dysautonomia. They can have postural orthostatic syndrome, gastrointestinal discomfort, Raynaud's, abnormal sweating, and so on and so forth. 75% also complain of headache, which can be due to so many causes like migraine, tension headaches, temporomandibular joint dislocation, CSF leak. And 86% can have abdominal and pelvic pain. And it is found that women with hypermobility syndrome, there is an increased incidence of endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome. They can also have psychosomatic features like anxiety and depression. So you can see the clinical spectrum, clinical presentation is wide. But the diagnosis is largely clinical, and it can be established in primary care setting. So here I have put forward a 5-point questionnaire for hypermobility. This is proposed by Dr. Alan Hakim. This can be used as a screening tool. So there are 5 questions, and if the answer is yes for 2 or more questions, it suggests there is joint hypermobility with a sensitivity and specificity of more than 80%. So once the initial screening is done, which can be done in the primary care setting, they can be referred to a rheumatologist, where we will perform the Beighton score. I'm sure most my rheumatologic colleagues are familiar with this. We check for the hypermobility in certain joint areas like the thumb, the little finger, the elbows, knees, as well as the back. And for each joint, we give 1 point. So the total is out of 9. So here you can see a picture of two eminent doctors who are involved in a lot of research involving hypermobility. On this side, you can see Dr. Alan Hakim, who proposed the 5-point questionnaire. On the other side, you can see Professor Rodney Graham. He's sort of like the world authority on hypermobility. In fact, he, together with his colleagues, are the ones who proposed the Brighton criteria, which is what we are going to do after we do the BITE scoring in these patients. So here you can see we have major criteria and minor criteria. So for the major criteria, if the Brighton score is more than 4 and arthralgia for more than 3 months in 4 joints, if both major criteria are present, we can diagnose our patient to be having benign joint hypermobility. If only one is present, then we need 2 minor criteria. If both major criteria are not met, we need 4 minor criteria. But important thing is we have to exclude other connective tissue disorders like Marfan's, pseudoxanthoma, Ehlers-Danlos to rule out to diagnose benign hypermobility syndrome. Now, on the other side, I have also put forward Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility type diagnostic criteria. Now, these criteria were initially put forward at a time when joint hypermobility syndrome and Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility type were thought to be 2 different clinical diseases. But now more and more evidence is being accumulated to suggest that these 2 may be in fact manifestations in a single spectrum of disease. So when you look at the major and minor, when you look at the diagnostic criteria for joint hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility type, you can see there is considerable overlap in the clinical manifestations. So in both these conditions, 5 to 10% of the patients were found to have reduced tennessine X levels, and however, they're likely to be genetically heterogeneous, although no gene has been diagnosed as the culprit for either of them yet. And the clinical spectrum, as I mentioned before, is often indistinguishable from one another. And both disorders may coexist in the same pedigrees and could not be distinguished in familial cases. So, therefore, they are likely to be part of the same clinical spectrum, where the milder versions are labeled as benign joint hypermobility, and more disabled individuals fit a diagnosis of hypermobile type Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So, once we diagnose these patients, we have to evaluate further. So we have to evaluate whether this hypermobility is generalized or localized, and also the degree of laxity, the shape of the bony articular surfaces, the muscle tone and proprioception, because all these things are important when we are going to design an exercise program for these patients. In addition to that, it's important we look out for the other extra-articular manifestations, like where we may have to review the cardiovascular system and the vasculature, because they can have varicose veins, and they can have they have a tendency for Raynaud's phenomenon, and also the skin, and also viscera for herniae, UV prolapse and rectal prolapse, and also signs of dysautonomia, fragile bones, and asthma, because these are associations of benign joint hypermobility syndrome. So once we do the evaluation, the management is multidisciplinary. So there are several people who are part of this multidisciplinary team. So physiotherapists plays an important part. In addition to that, we need the occupational therapists to concentrate on this ergonomic assessment of the hands, the podiatrists to review the feet and the ankles, because these patients tend to have flat feet and can present with clinical manifestations associated with flat feet, and maybe a referral to the pain clinic if conventional analgesia is not helping. And there are certain theories that have been put forward, like, whether we should in fact completely reduce the pain, because pain serves as a protective mechanism in these patients. So if it's not for the pain, the patients will in fact damage their joints further. However, pain management is an important part in these patients, and the rheumatologist is normally the person who will coordinate the overall process, and the orthoptist is also an important part, because we need protective splinting before we improve their muscle control. And psychotherapists to advise on pacing the activities, counseling, and orthopedic surgeon, because sometimes we may need to reduce the joint capsular volume to reduce the laxity of these joints. Now, this is sort of like the framework that is being used in the hypermobility clinic in the University College London, where Professor Rodney Graham conducts his clinic. So I thought I'd go into a little bit detail about the physiotherapy goals in benign joint hypermobility. So we need to restore the normal range of movement, even if the patient is hypermobile, because the patient may be stiff in certain areas, and while mobilizing the stiff areas, the patients need to gain control over the hypermobile areas. In addition to that, we need to improve the postural control, alignment, proprioception, and balance of these patients. In addition to that, strengthening of the stabilizer muscles, both of the core and the periphery, is important to gain joint stability. The physiotherapist can also provide advice and problem solving skills for these patients, especially how to take care of the joints, and also lifestyle advice, especially when selecting an occupation. Now, most of the patients who present to our clinics are young patients, so it's important that we advise these patients about the occupation, because patients with hypermobility syndrome, they do worse on jobs which require a static posture throughout the day, and they do better in occupations where frequent change of posture is required. In addition to that, we need to maintain their general fitness to keep up their stamina, strength, and endurance. So swimming, Pilates, and yoga are some of the exercises that they can take part without putting undue strain on their joints. So I'd like to present to you some of the findings of this paper, which was published in Arthritis and Rheumatism, on the effect of exercise in patients with joint hypermobility. So you can see so this is the knee joint proprioception, which is shown on the left before and after the exercise program. So you can see the threshold angle, in fact, has reduced. So that means the joint proprioception has improved after the exercise program. In addition, on the right side, you can see the balance board performance, which has also improved after the exercise program. And here you can see the muscle strength of the quadriceps and hamstrings, which has shown a significant difference after the exercise program. And they have checked the quality of life before and after the exercise program using SF36 questionnaire. So you can see there is statistically significant improvement in the p-values in both physical functioning and mental health after an exercise program. So what do we tell these patients on whom we have diagnosed benign joint hypermobility syndrome? So we can tell them that it's non-progressive and non-inflammatory, and that the symptoms may attenuate with age. So things can get better, they will not stay the same. And however, they are at risk of premature osteoarthritis, probably related to the recurrent microtrauma to the joints. And there are several papers that have found that benign joint hypermobility is in fact protective for progression of radiographic hand osteoarthritis. And premenopausal females with hypermobility have a 1.8-fold risk of osteoporosis. But having said that, looking at the bright side, you can always tell them that the flexibility that is rendered to them by their disease can be an asset in certain fields like gymnastics, dancing, and athletics. So to demonstrate that, I have put forward some of pictures of people with hypermobility. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with her. She's Sophie Dorsey. She's a self-taught contortionist who has gone to excel as a performer. And this is a Paganini. It was thought that he was a maestro at his time, that is in 19th century. Because of his hypermobility, the fingering in the violin is, the scope was more for him. So that's why he was able to do all these compositions, and that's why he was a great violinist. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with Shakira. She's also someone with benign joint hypermobility. And this Paralympic gold medalist who is taking part in triathlon. All these are people with hypermobility syndrome. So the take-home message of today's lecture is that hypermobility is commoner than you think, commoner than rheumatoid arthritis, and the diagnosis is clinical, so you can make the diagnosis in your clinic. Remember the biting criteria, so don't forget your thumbs, your pinkies, your elbows, your knees, and your back. And there are many extra-articular associations. So always, once you diagnose hypermobility, don't forget to look at these extra-articular associations, particularly the heart. And a good exercise program can make a difference. So that brings to the end of my lecture. And thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Sachitra.
Yes, we do have a question, sir, from Gunendrika madam. I think if she's there, she could ask.
Yes.
Yeah, the question is, how symptomatic and disabled are they with aging?
So aging is in fact a double-edged sword for these patients. So with age, yes, the joint, with the acquired joint stiffness, hypermobility can improve. But at the same time, because they are predisposed for premature osteoarthritis, the symptoms related to osteoarthritis may predominate the symptoms that were associated with joint hypermobility.
Thank you, Sakita.
Any other questions, Chiranta?
No, so at the moment, that's all.
Anybody else wants to have a question before we move on to the next one? You can unmute and okay, in absence of any other questions,
We do have Monica madam and Jeevani madam who have unmuted their mics. So there might be questions.
Do you advise swimming? These patients swimming?
Yes, madam. Now, as I mentioned in the types of exercises they should take part, in addition to the stabilization and the exercises to improve the proprioception balance and postural control, they need exercises to maintain their general fitness. So definitely swimming, Pilates, and yoga are some of the exercises that we recommend that they should take part to maintain their stamina and endurance.
Okay.
Do you have any more questions? Jeevani is.
There don't seem to be any more questions, sir.
Thank you very much again for doing that lecture. We will move on to the next lecture by Dr. Angela De Silva Vijayaratna, who is a senior registrar at Rehabilitation Hospital, Ragama, to take over the lecture based on the on a journal article. Over to you, Angela.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today my talk is about axial spondyloarthritis management, what is in the guidelines. When considering the spondyloarthritis, it's a form of chronic inflammatory arthritis which comprises of different interrelated conditions where there is involvement of the axial joints, peripheral joints, as well as there are some extra-articular manifestation involving the skin, eye, and the gut. But the ankylosing spondylitis is the prototype of the spondyloarthritis. But the other conditions like psoriatic arthritis, reactive arthritis, and the arthropathy of inflammatory bowel disease, undifferentiated spondyloarthritis, and juvenile spondyloarthritis are also taken part to that. When considering the spondyloarthritis, it can be divided into mainly two parts, whether it's axial spondyloarthritis or peripheral spondyloarthritis, depending on the predominant joint involvement. The axial part, that's predominant axial joint involvement, and that can be further divided into whether it's non-radiographic or radiographic, depending on the plain radiography findings. There is radiographic sacroiliitis, that is the unilateral, there is grade 3 or more, as well as bilateral grade 2 or more. There is, if those features are present in the plain radiography, those patients come to the category of radiographic axial SPA. And if there are no features of no radiographic features in the plain radiography, those patients come to the non-radiographic group, but they can have the MRI findings of sacroiliitis. Although it was mentioned as two categories, it seems that it's a continuation, it's a spectrum of a disease where the patients with non-radiographic axial SPA can progress to radiographic axial SPA, but not all. Roughly mentioned that about 5 to 10% of patients progress to radiographic axial SPA in 5 years, and about 20% of patients progress to radiographic axial SPA in about 5 years. Regarding the goals of management, these are the goals that have established. The symptom relief of the patients, mainly with the intention of improve the quality of life, and maintenance of the function, and prevent complications of the spinal disease, and minimize the extraspinal as well as the extra-articular manifestation of the disease and the related comorbidities. And the maintenance of effective psychosocial functioning. My reference was mainly based on the 2019 update of the American College of Rheumatology criteria. This guideline, they have described several definitions which include which are important in the later discussion. Where the active disease they have mentioned as the disease causing symptoms at an unacceptably bothersome level to the patient, as well as judged by the clinician, which are thought to be due to the inflammation of the disease. And with regard to the stable, the definition of the stable disease has mentioned as the disease that is thought to be asymptomatic or causing symptoms but at acceptable levels as reported by the patient. There should be at least minimum of 6 months to mention that the disease is clinically stable. The primary non-response is another term which was described as if there's absence of clinically meaningful improvement of the disease activity over 3 to 6 months after treatment initiation, but which are not related to the toxicity or the poor adherence, they are categorized as primary non-responders. There is a recurrence of symptoms after the initiation of treatment, initially having a clinically meaningful improvement, and they are termed as secondary non-response. With regard to the active radiological axial spondyloarthritis, I will be discussing about the following topics. Physical therapy, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and the disease-modifying anti-rheumatoid drugs, which are further categorized into the conventional synthetic, targeted synthetic, and the biologics, as well as the glucocorticoid. Regarding the physical therapy, it's one of the main mode of treatment in axial spondyloarthritis, which is as important as the pharmacological treatment. It is strongly recommend the treatment with physical therapy for patients over no treatment with that. And there's a conditional recommendation that the active physical therapy interventions are better than the passive physical therapy intervention. And they have recommended land-based physical therapy interventions to be better over the aquatic therapy interventions. With regard to the NSAIDs, for active radiological axial SPA patient, they have conditionally recommend continuous treatment over on-demand treatment to control the disease severity. It was supported by a study done in 2005 with the use of celecoxib. Although there have been no significant differences in patient-reported outcomes, there had been a less radiographic progression. But there's another study done in 2016, Endoros trial, which was done with diclofenac sodium. There have not been a significant difference in radiographic progression. But although this recommendation was made, this may vary depending on the symptom severity as well as the patient preferences and the comorbidities mainly involving the GI system, kidney, and the cardiovascular disease. They have not mentioned any particular NSAID as a preferred choice. With regard to the DMARDs, for active radiological SPA, despite on NSAIDs, they have conditionally recommended sulfasalazine, methotrexate, or tofacitinib over no treatment with them. That is mainly for the patient who are having prominent peripheral arthritis with few or no axial symptoms. With regard to the sulfasalazine, there's a study done in 2017, which had shown a clinically significant improvement in axial symptoms with the change in ASDAS score of more than 1.1 when compared to placebo. And there's a significantly greater change for the BASDAI and BASMI scores as well. And it is considered in patients mainly who have contraindications for TNF-alpha inhibitors and also patients who decline or who have limited access to the biologics. With regard to tofacitinib, which is a targeted synthetic DMARD, which is currently available in Sri Lanka and registered for the use, it has shown a benefit in clinical and imaging outcomes for axial diseases over 12 weeks, or in studies done over the 12 weeks, and it has also mentioned it has a favorable safety profile. Although the previous conventional synthetic DMARD had not shown any improvement in the axial symptoms, these have shown improvement in the axial disease as well. Because of the finding of the non-response, the following drugs are not recommended: the leflunomide, apremilast, thalidomide, and the pamidronate, of which pamidronate was recommended in early studies. Regarding the biologic, the TNF-alpha inhibitors was the main drug considered in the axial SPA. For the patient who having active radiological axial SPA, despite NSAIDs, they have strongly recommended TNF-alpha treatment over no treatment with them over the treatment with tofacitinib and IL-17 inhibitor. But they have not mentioned a particular TNF inhibitor as a preferred choice, rather than if there are any other comorbid conditions which have to be considered. Mainly, infliximab was shown to be increased as associated with increased risk of tuberculosis and other chronic infection. So, in a patients who have a higher risk of TB exposure or with a history of recurrent infections, some other drug other than the infliximab should be considered. And prior to escalating to a TNF-alpha inhibitor, the NSAID responsive should be judged. And the lack of response to at least 2 different NSAID groups at maximum doses over 1 month, or if there is incomplete response to at least 2 different NSAIDs over 2 months, then those patients should be considered for escalation of the biologics. And the recommendation for the primary and secondary non-responses differ in this recommendation. For the patients who are primary non-responders, they have conditionally recommended treatment with secukinumab or hexaconazole or treatment with other than different TNF-alpha inhibitor. What they have thought is in that patient, the TNF-alpha inhibitor may not be the key inflammatory mediator which in the disease. But for the patients who are having the secondary non-response, they have conditionally recommended treatment with a different TNF-alpha inhibitor over treatment with the other biologic groups. And for the patients who are having active radiological axial SpA, despite treatment with the first TNF-alpha inhibitor, they have strongly recommended against switching to a treatment with the biosimilar of the same drug. And for the patients who are on treatment with the first TNF-alpha inhibitor, they have conditionally recommended against the addition of a sulfasalazine or methotrexate in favor of treatment with the new biologic. But for the sulfasalazine, it can be considered in patients in whom the axial symptoms are very well controlled, but they are who have an active peripheral arthritis component. And for the both active and stable radiological axial SpA patients who are on treatment with TNF-alpha inhibitors, they have conditionally recommended against co-treatment with low dose of methotrexate. Where in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, there had shown to be a important factor by reducing the development of anti-drug antibodies. In SpA patient, it's the evidence of the use of methotrexate is thus clear, and there's found to be a great burden for the patients. But it could be considered in patients who is treated with infliximab. Regarding the IL-17 inhibitors, for active radiological axial SpA, despite treatment with NSAIDs, they have strongly recommended treatment with the above drug over treatment with the tofacitinib. And for the patients with coexisting ulcerative colitis, but if the TNF-alpha is not an option, but then in that condition, tofacitinib should be considered over these IL-17s as they have been shown to be not effective in inflammatory bowel disease. And for the patients with active radiological SpA, despite treatment with NSAIDs and who have contraindications for TNF-alpha inhibitors, they have recommended IL-17 inhibitors over treatment with sulfasalazine, methotrexate, or tofacitinib, as those drugs are found to be not worsening the condition like congestive heart failure or demyelinating disease. And for TB, other chronic infection, or other patients who have high risk of recurrent infection, sulfasalazine was preferred over IL-17 inhibitor and tofacitinib. And for those patients who are having the contraindication because of infection, TNF-alpha may be considered after the infection is controlled. Due to the lack of effectiveness, following drugs are not recommended even if the patients are having contraindications to TNF-alpha inhibitors. Regarding the steroids, they have strongly recommended against treatment with systemic glucocorticoid. But if the patient is having isolated active sacroiliitis despite treatment with NSAIDs, in that instance, the locally administered parenteral glucocorticoids were conditionally recommended. And also for the patients who are having stable axial disease with active enthesitis or active peripheral arthritis, in that instance also the locally administered parenteral glucocorticoids were conditionally recommended. This slide is a summary of what I talked about the management of the active axial SpA management. And with regard to the stable disease, that is, if the patient is having if the patient are asymptomatic or having a acceptable level of symptoms, for those patients also following management options were considered. Regarding the physical therapy, it was strongly recommended for them. And as well as for the NSAID, the patients when contrast to the patients who are having active disease, for the stable patients, they have conditionally recommended on-demand treatment with NSAID over continuous treatment. For that, the patients whose condition had been stable while not receiving any other pharmacological treatment, as well as they have considered the potential toxicity of the continuous NSAID treatment, which has outweighed the uncertain benefit of the radiographic progression. And those NSAID should be considered for short-term symptom recurrence. With regard to the TNF-alpha inhibitors, for stable patients who's receiving treatment with TNF-alpha and NSAID both, they have conditionally recommended to continue on with the TNF-alpha inhibitor. As well as for the patients receiving both the TNF-alpha inhibitor and conventional DMARDs, they have are recommended only to continue the TNF inhibitor alone. And for the stable patients who's having receiving treatment with the biologic, they have conditionally recommended against the discontinuation of the biologic, given the fact in the studies it had shown after the discontinuation of the treatment about 60 to 70% of patients has had a relapses. It can occur within few weeks to months from, and it can, although it's mentioned, the above trial mentioned for the TNF-alpha inhibitors, can apply to the other biologics as well. But the discontinuation can be considered in sustained remission. For the patients, for the stable patients who are receiving treatment with the biologic, they have conditionally recommended against tapering the biological dose as standard approach. And for the stable patients who are on treatment with TNF-alpha inhibitor, they have again strongly recommended continuing treatment with the original product rather than switching to a biosimilar product, as they have thought the medication changes can increase the risk of destabilizing the patient's condition. So this is the summary of the management of the patient with stable condition, which I have discussed earlier. And with regard to the radiological ex-USPA related comorbidities, for patients having recurrent uveitis, they have conditionally recommended treatment with TNF-alpha monoclonal antibodies over treatment with the other biologics. And the recurrence rate have been lower with adalimumab and infliximab compared to the etanercept. But the secukinumab was not found to be effective in the patient with who's having panuveitis or posterior uveitis. And for the patients having a radiological ex-USPA and inflammatory bowel disease, they have not recommended any particular NSAID as the preferred choice to decrease the risk of worsening symptoms. But conditionally, they have conditionally recommended treatment with TNF-alpha monoclonal antibodies over treatment with other biologics. And for the patients who are having the risk of IBD, the infliximab and the adalimumab have shown that have been proven to be associated over the risk of IBD exacerbation than with etanercept. As previously mentioned, for the recurrent uveitis, the IL-17 inhibitor secukinumab was associated with a new onset or exacerbation of Crohn's disease, and ixekizumab was found to have increased risk of IBD exacerbations. And for the patients who are having active or stable non-radiographic axial SPA, all the other modalities of treatment have been similar as discussed for the radiological axial SPA. In contrast, for those patients, the IL-17 inhibitors are only conditionally recommended, as there had been not much trial evidences, as well as for tofacitinib inhibitor, there had been more evidence in the use in non-radiological axial SPA. With regard to assessing the disease activity, for the active radiological axial SPA, they have conditionally recommended against using the treat to target strategy, where the target had been the score for less than 1.3, or a treatment strategy based on a physician assessment. This has been it's a change from the 2016 EULA guideline, where they have recommended a treat to target strategy. And also for the patients with radiological as well as non-radiological axial SPA, they are having unclear activity while receiving a biologic. they have conditionally recommended to get a spinal or pelvic MRI to assess the activity, but not for the patient with clearly inactive or clearly active disease. And they have also conditionally recommended against obtaining a repeat spinal radiographic at a scheduled interval, like for every 2 years, as there had been no significant of that. And in summary, for the patients with the management of the axial SPA patient, the NSAIDs and the TNF alpha inhibitors are the main drug classes, as well as the physical therapy plays an important role in the management. And with regard to the IL-17 inhibitors, patients with active disease who have heart failure or demyelinating disease as a contraindication to TNF alpha inhibitor, and also in primary non-responders to TNF alpha inhibitors, these drugs can be used, but it is not recommended in patients with IBD or recurrent uveitis. And with regard to the tofacitinib, it's a potential second-line option for the patients who are having contraindications to TNF alpha inhibitor, as it has shown a good response in axial symptoms as well. This is a summary of the guideline. There had been change from the 2015 guideline and the 2019 ACR guideline, where in 2015 guideline, when there's active disease and there are contraindications to TNF alpha inhibitors, they have recommended sulfasalazine and halidonet. But now, as the second line, they have recommended either IL-17 or the tofacitinib therapy. And for the in the 2015 guideline for the TNFI failure, they have planned a trial of a second TNF alpha inhibitors, but in the latest guideline, it depends whether it's a primary or a secondary non-response. And as mentioned before, therefore, the recurrent uveitis and IBD, the 2015 guideline had asked for a conditional use of infliximab or adalimumab over etanercept, but in the current guideline, they have generally recommended the TNF alpha monoclonal antibody. And for the patients who are having active non-radiological axial SPA, TNF alpha inhibitors had been a conditional recommended in 2015, but in the latest guideline, there's a strong recommendation for that. And that's all for today's talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Any questions, Chiranti?
I have a clarification to make, if I understood it.
Yes.
Earlier, we thought, my understanding at least was, there's no place for oral CSD marks or active actual disease, but in this guideline, it seems to be so, isn't it?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, earlier the thought was there's no place for oral or conventional DMARDs. There was no place for conventional DMARDs in active actual disease. So we went for biologics. So in this guideline, it has changed, is it?
For the sulfasalazine, they have recommended, but only in the patients who are having active peripheral arthritis. When they are not having or having only few axial symptoms, only they have recommended.
Is that the case? So that was not clear to me in your presentation. That I wanted to clarify that. So it's still for the peripheral arthritis, is it?
Yes.
Mainly, but I think there's
general recommendation that those can be used, but they have discussed mainly for the patients who are having peripheral arthritis.
And also, you show there's one trial which has actually shown for the axial they have given, and there's some response.
Yeah.
Based on that, I think probably they have thought about adding it also in case or as a second line, probably.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, there's another request for Angela of whether she could revisit the summary slide that she had at the middle for the one I'm assuming that they're talking about the summary slide with the flow diagram for management of active axial SPA.
Trying to go to share.
Okay. And there is another question, sir, from Himal. What are instances with back pain you want us to refer to a rheumatologist? since we don't have easy access to MRI.
First, this is the summary slide. Yeah. Any questions on that?
No, so not this one. The one with the that was at the middle of the presentation.
Yeah. You want the active one or non-active one?
I think this message came as soon as Angela finished this slide, the active one.
Active one. Active one is this.
Right, yeah, that's
Yes.
Regarding the active axial disease, the NSAIDs and the physical therapy are the equally effective. And for the patients who are having, they have not recommended systemic glucocorticoids for them. And patients who are having predominant peripheral arthritis, despite the NSAIDs, they have recommended local steroid injection or the addition of sulfasalazine. And for the patients who are having isolated sacroiliitis or enthesitis, NSAID is recommended. And for those with isolated sacroiliitis or enthesitis, despite NSAID, the local steroid injections are recommended. And as for the second line, for the patients who are having active disease despite NSAID, TNF-alpha inhibitors have been recommended as the first line therapy for those patients. But with regard to the TNF-alpha for the patients, and for the third line, for the patients who are inhibitor, they have not recommended addition of methotrexate. And when for the patients who are primary non-responders for the TNF-alpha inhibitor, they have recommended secukinumab and ixekizumab. And for the secondary non-responders, they have recommended to try an alternative TNF-alpha inhibitor rather than going for the IL-17. And for the patient with recurrent uveitis and inflammatory bowel disease, they have recommended TNF-alpha monoclonal antibodies rather than the other biologics.
What was the other question?
The other question is, what are the instances in which we want others to refer patients with back pain to a rheumatologist, as there's no easy access to MRI facilities?
It's usually when the patient is having an inflammatory kind of a back pain and the age of onset is usually less than 40 years, suggestive of the patient, the back pain is due to axial spondyloarthritis. The type of the features of inflammatory arthritis, which is worsening with the rest and it improves with movements, and there is a nocturnal awakening due to pain, as well as there is early morning stiffness. Those patients can be referred to as well as who has a chronic history, usually more than 3 months. Those patients can be referred to a rheumatologist. Consider the possibility of a spondyloarthritis.
In addition to, even if they have MRI facility, what is going to happen is if you just ask for a MRI back lumbar spine or whatever for a back pain protocol, most of the time they miss the inflammatory part, because you have to, unless you ask specifically for inflammatory MRI specifically, that is you have to have fat suppression or stir views, they will not see that. So it's a dangerous actually to go for MRI, and then if they report it's only maybe disc prolapse and things like that, which anybody will have mild ones. So I think if there's any, I think best advice will be if there's any inflammatory features like early morning stiffness, younger patients, necessary, the rheumatologist I think should be the one who should be asking for an MRI.
Right, sir. And so there's another question from Monica Madam, 2 questions actually. One is, are land-based exercises better than aquatic exercises?
In one study, madam, they had been shown some better response in the aquatic based therapy, but as the evidence was not very clear and for the easy access and for the purpose of the continuation, they have recommended the land-based therapy rather than for the aquatic therapy.
Yes, Angela, and the other comment from Madam is, even for patients with psoriasis and axial SpA, no recommendation on IL-17 inhibitors? Is that,
as primary, first biologics?
Yes, madam. Could you repeat the question for all of us?
No, my question is, so if you diagnose, the recommendation is for TNF inhibitors. But even in patients with psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis plus axial SpA, are there recommendations to start with IL-17 inhibitors? So as first choice, they don't recommend, isn't it? Do they recommend IL-17 inhibitors as first choice?
I'm not very sure about that, madam.
Yeah, I think
No
even
recommendation, no, in here.
they
Yeah.
go as a first recommendation. As for first recommendation,
Yeah,
for
only TNF
psoriasis,
inhibitors.
I don't think there is a say to go straight away for IL-17. I'm not very sure. Is it there?
No, in this one they don't mention. They just mention that TNF inhibitors are the first choice.
Yes. For any axial SpA, they talk about here also as the TNF inhibitors are the first choice for the moment.
But if you listen, I think probably you have listened that IL-17 with that PEBNA, so they recommended IL-17 inhibitors for if there's psoriatic arthritis and even as first choice in other patients.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't know whether it's just because of the peripheral things or whether the skin is involved. Probably can.
Skin. Yeah, skin.
Yeah, I think it's mainly the skin, no?
Yeah, skin plus axial SpA. Then IL-17 inhibitors would work better, but the recommendation here is TNF inhibitors, I think.
Yeah, I think they are mainly considering the sort of
axial
spondyloarthritis, mainly the ankylosing spondylitis. If you see this draft also, they are talking about AS, which is of course the previous classification.
Yes.
So if you take, I think most of these things are just still talking about as a AS rather than the combination with the psoriatic and things. I think are not taken as in this guideline.
Yeah, if there is uveitis, always you have to go for TNF inhibitors, I think, because IL-17 inhibitors are not effective. And if there's IBD, they have mentioned it here. If they are.
But now the primary, without the spondyloarthropathy, it's recurrent uveitis.
No, for
they treat methotrexate. No?
Yes, first methotrexate. But if so, I'm talking about axial.
No, I'm wondering why the methotrexate is not here recommended when it's uveitis with AS. Why is the methotrexate? They have said definitely not recommended. And why is that? Is a question I have. When when you have primarily uveitis, only recurrent uveitis, the present treatment is seem to be methotrexate.
Actually, now now they don't. Here, according to this recommendation, they don't want to continue methotrexate with infliximab, isn't it? But if it is rheumatoid arthritis,
as a prophylaxis, that is against getting the antibodies.
Yeah, but in
that's a difference.
They don't recommend.
No, they say there is not much evidence. No?
Yeah,
that's what Angela told us. Yeah, but I know the even not a place in Britain also they still use about, I don't know whether once this they are changed, but 10 milligram of methotrexate is generally given. They are on.
Now probably they have changed it.
Yeah, probably with this.
Thank you.
Any other questions? What else want?
Yeah, there aren't any questions in the chat, sir, but if any of the participants want to ask questions.
Anybody want to go over? Okay, in absence of any further questions, I thank everybody for joining this done by the College of Specialists in Rheumatology and Rehabilitation Sri Lanka. We had two totally webinars. We were able to conduct two without missing due to COVID. And so 3rd of July, we'll meet at Pinmark. And hope that we'll be coming, and if possible we'll try to also either at least have a recording of that and put it on the web. So before winding up, I would like to thank Dexa Medica for helping us with some part of advertising and as our usual partners in this program, and they kept helping us even during the last one. So hope we'll see all first Friday of July. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.